So now that you know my history with the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo, and you became aware of the fact that I used to have a mullet,
The graphics are so cool!
it's time to have these two 16-bit titans go toe-to-toe and see who was the true king of the 4th generation.
My ass is king, man.
And Sexy Coco will be co-hosting. Ugh.
I'm sexy.
Round 2, fight!
There's no competition with this one. I totally agree with James Rolfe.
Genesis is genocide Mega Drives.
You can't even compare the American Super Nintendo with the Sega Genesis.
The Sega Genesis is sleek, black, and sexy like me, man. It's smooth and curvaceous, and lets you know it's strong and 16-bit like my nuts.
Your nuts are 16-bit?
Shut your titties a minute, man. Coco got that exclusive interview with the Nintendo man himself, Ken Kutaragi.
Whoa, you mean Shigeru Miyamoto. Ken Kutaragi is called the father of the PlayStation. He was on the Sony side. Shigeru Miyamoto is the brainchild of all the exclusive franchises on the Nintendo side. He's the man you had the interview with. I'm just saying.
Stop flapping your titties and roll the video.
Alrighty.
When we were designing the United States version of the Super Nintendo, we chose a square and bland design. In the early 90s, Americans liked their technology to look like shit, so we gave them shit. We also choose to use purple, power, and reset switches because that color arouses me. I often make my wife wear purple panties and smack her ass until it turns blue, like a baboon's, which also arouses me.
Alright, my god, too much information. But it's true though, what were they thinking? Look at the Japanese Super Famicom, it's a great looking system, it looks beautiful, that's why it's so desirable today. Now look at the American Super Nintendo, it's just blah, it's just boring, it's square, there's nothing appealing about it. Now look at the Model 1 Sega Genesis, it has nice lines to it, it has that black color which makes it more appealing. It doesn't even look dated today, like if you have it on your desk, it still looks like a new piece of equipment if you take care of it. The design of the Model 1 Sega Genesis just seems more well thought out. It even had a headphone jack built right onto the system with a volume control. So if you were a kid and wanted to play games late at night, just plug in a pair of headphones and you could rock out the stereo Sega Genesis sound. The bottom line is the Sega Genesis is sexy and the Super Nintendo isn't. Shockingly, I agree with Coco on this one. The Sega Genesis wins hands down. Now this is where my opinion differs from James. Yes, the Super Nintendo controller was pretty comfortable, it had more buttons than the original Sega Genesis controller, and it did incorporate the L and R shoulder buttons which were revolutionary at the time.
But the Sega Genesis controller was more ergonomicalized, man.
Ergonomicalized, okay. Just keep talking.
Shut your asshole, man. The Sega Genesis controller just melted into your hands real nice like, you know what I'm saying? So you could be quick with the maneuvers like my sexy ass. Peep game. Oh yeah, bitch, that's my nuts and my penis. Now check out my ass, bitch. Seen that shit? That's a real ass right there, man.
You think I care?
Fuck is you saying? Gently your vagina, bitch. Respect the king.
What the hell was that? What did that have to do with anything?
My nuts are ergonomic, man.
Anyway, let's get down to business here. What you see in front of you is 3 video game controllers. This is the original Sega Genesis controller. This came out with the launch of the system. Only had 3 face buttons over here. You have the Super Nintendo controller, and then you have the Sega Genesis 6-button controller. This came out later on in the system's life, so it could be easier to use with fighting games. But we're going to talk about the Super Nintendo controller first. So let's take a look at it here. The Super Nintendo controller was pretty damn comfortable. It had the dog bone shape to it like James mentioned, and it was revolutionary for the time for one reason. Not only did it have 4 front-facing buttons, which that wasn't a big deal, but it had the L and R shoulder buttons. If you played games like Star Fox, you'll realize why these were revolutionary. And every mainstream system that came out after the Super Nintendo had L and R shoulder buttons. But there was one big shortcoming, at least to me, when it came to the Super Nintendo controller. Yes, it did have 6 buttons, so when you played fighting games, they were compatible right out of the box. But the thing is say you played Street Fighter 2 on the Super Nintendo. The power punch and power kick were allocated to the L and R shoulder buttons. And when you try to do like Ryu's spin kick or try to do his fireball, and you wanted to do the quickest ones were always with the power buttons. So if you want to do the fastest fireball or Hadouken with Ryu, you had to use the L button up on top here. That was a problem with me. It was very awkward to try to pull off moves with the L and R buttons. And I didn't like the Super Nintendo controller when it came to fighting games due to that reason. So when I played Street Fighter 2 or Mortal Kombat on the Super Nintendo, I always ended up just using the 4 face buttons over here, and I kind of stayed away from the L and R buttons. Now if you take a look at the Sega Genesis controller, alright, first shortcoming right off the bat is the fact that there isn't 6 buttons on the original controller. So when you played Street Fighter 2 or Street Fighter 2 Turbo, so on and so forth, fighting games in general, if you wanted to switch between punches and kicks, you would have to hit the start button. You know what though? I had Street Fighter 2 for both the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, and I have to say that really wasn't a big deal. Once you got used to hitting start to switch between the punches and the kicks, you needed to do a kick, boom, you hit that real quick and you were right back in action. On top of it too, with the Sega Genesis controller, here's one thing that James didn't mention. Look at the 2 directional pads. One thing I liked about the directional pad on the Sega Genesis is in between, each direction, there was a piece of plastic. So when you wanted to do Ryu's fireball or his, any kind of, special move, it was kind of a smoother maneuver than it was on the Super Nintendo controller because they had those little pieces of plastic in between. Same with the 6-button controller. Now, before I even get into the 6-button controller, one other thing I want to mention too, and this one just came out of left field. James said one big shortcoming with the Sega Genesis controller, and it was really off to me. Here, take a look, I'll show you some footage real quick.
In a Mario type game, I can hold down Y to run and push the rest of my thumb onto B to jump. It helps that the buttons are all on an angle. On Genesis, they're all in a straight line. I have to hop my thumb back and forth.
Let me tell you something. I heard them when was it ever a big deal? Like he said that if you had to go from A to C, it was like a huge jump for your thumb. I've played many a platformer on the Sega Genesis. I've played the hell out of Castlevania Bloodlines, and not once ever did I go, oh man, to go from A to C to use this special move in Castlevania Bloodlines to go to jump it's way too far for me. I totally don't agree with that at all. I thought this controller, because it was a little bit bigger, I never felt fatigue when I used it, and I thought it was very well laid out. Yes, it was not a revolutionary design, it just added one extra face button here. And if you think about it, the original Genesis controller doesn't have any more buttons than an original Nintendo controller. There's no select on here. They just took the select and made it into a face button. But it's comfortable because it's a larger controller. It didn't fatigue my hands, and I thought it was fantastic. Now let's talk about the 6-button controller. Now, if you remember before, I mentioned the L and R buttons and how awkward they were with fighting games. Yes, okay, out of the box, you could play Mortal Kombat, all the Street Fighter games and fighting games, and you would have the 6 buttons at your disposal using the Super Nintendo controller that came with your system. But it wasn't ideal for fighting games, at least to me. Now, when you got the 6-button controller for the Sega Genesis, yes, this is an aftermarket one, but it's pretty much identical, so you get the point. You have your XYZ ABC. Playing Street Fighter with this controller was amazing. It wasn't awkward to do the power, Hadouken. You could do the fastest Hadouken. You could do the fastest spin kick. And on top of it, I love the directional pad on here. And once again, it has those little plastic nubs in between each direction, so it was easier. It was a much smoother experience trying to pull off special moves. The only thing I don't like about this is that it was a little bit smaller than the original Sega Genesis controller, but honestly, this was way superior to use for games in the 16-bit era than the Super Nintendo controller was. So yes, I know James thought the Super Nintendo controller was better, but I feel that the original Sega Genesis controller, just for comfort alone, and the 6-button Sega Genesis controller were way superior. So I have to give this round to the Sega Genesis for 2 reasons, and they're right here.
I'm at a local retro game shop in my area, and what you're looking at right now is Sega Genesis games. Now you're looking at Super Nintendo games. Again, Sega Genesis games, now Super Nintendo games. Are you seeing the difference here? Yeah, exactly. A ton of the Sega Genesis games are still in their original boxes, whereas virtually all the SNES games at the store are just loose cartridges without the box. That's because Sega Genesis games actually came in jewel cases, where SNES games just came in cardboard boxes, which would deteriorate over time. I'm sure it was cheaper for Nintendo to manufacture cardboard boxes instead of plastic jewel cases for their game cartridges, but the plastic Sega Genesis game boxes protected the cartridges much better than the dust covers that were included with SNES carts. Also, from a collector's standpoint, having plastic boxes on your shelf with game art on them is a hell of a lot cooler than just having dirty gray cartridges lined up across the shelf. Again, I gotta agree with James on this one. There's no contest. The Sega Genesis wins this round hands down. In this round, I don't know what the nerd was smoking when he gave the SNES the crown for backwards compatibility. He chose the SNES for 2 reasons, and to be honest, both of them don't really make any sense. The first reason he stated was the fact that the SNES had the Super Game Boy cartridge. This allowed you to play Game Boy games on the Super Nintendo. The second reason he gave is because of this debacle I'd never even heard of until I watched James's video called the Super 8. This was an unlicensed peripheral that allowed you to play NES games on the Super Nintendo. But before I rip that device a new one, let's talk about the Super Game Boy. For one, the Super Game Boy was not released until 1994. That's approximately 3 years after the Super Nintendo's launch. On top of that, the SNES being able to play Game Boy games wouldn't really be backwards compatibility, it would more so be cross compatibility. The Game Boy in 1994 was still a very relevant platform. Hell, there wasn't a successor to the Game Boy until the Game Boy Color came out in 1998. The point I'm trying to make is that the Super Game Boy did not make the Super Nintendo a backwards compatible device, because it was just letting you play games from Nintendo's other very relevant portable platform at the time. Now let's talk about the Super 8. Once again, this is an unlicensed product that allows you to play NES games on your Super Nintendo. Sounds lovely, right? But it fails miserably. For one, the SNES did not have any of the original Nintendo Entertainment System's hardware inside of it, so the Super 8 had a Nintendo on a chip built into it. This meant that there would be compatibility issues when you played NES games using the Super 8 on the Super Nintendo. Have you ever used a crappy NES clone system before? Yeah, that's the experience you're gonna get. I also read that there were issues with the Super 8's SNES pass-through slot. They tried to make it convenient so you would never have to remove the Super 8 to play SNES games on your console. But even playing Super Nintendo games on the Super 8 would cause issues from time to time. For example, if you owned the compilation cartridge Super Mario All-Stars Plus World, there were occasions where the screen would start rolling, making playing the game practically impossible on the Super 8. The bottom line is, the Super 8 was a piece of shit! And I'm surprised that James even used it to compare the backwards compatibility capabilities of both the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. Now let's talk about the backwards compatibility of the Sega Genesis. It was built with backwards compatibility in mind. The Sega Genesis had all the hardware of its predecessor, the Sega Master System, built right into it. So if you purchased a Sega Genesis back in the early 90s, all you had to do was buy the Sega licensed peripheral, the Power Base converter, to play Sega Master System games on your Sega Genesis. And because all of the Sega Master System hardware was inside the Sega Genesis, all the games would work. It was 100% compatible with the Sega Master System. James, I love you, man. I think you kick ass, but I have to use your own phrase against you. What the fuck were you thinking? As if you couldn't tell, the Genesis wins the backwards compatibility category hands down. Please. Now this is more than likely going to be the most controversial category in this entire video.
I can tell you right now which system had the best graphicalness, man.
Oh, fuck your back.
Move your nipples away from that microphone.
Ow!
Move your stupid ass.
Jesus! Oh!
Almost ripped my
nipple off.
Have a seat, you John Goodman looking motherfucker. Now back in the day, Sexy Coco actually auditionalized for the blast processization commercial, man. Peep game. The Sega Genesis got that blast processorizing. Super Nintendo got my ass. So what does blast processization do? It makes you sexy. The Sega Genesis. It'll make you sexy, motherfucker.
That's it, you're cut off.
The fuck is you talking about, man?
Get off the
Fucking
microphone.
titties. Get off my ass, man.
Get the hell out of here, Jesus.
Put on a bra.
Well, besides for him trying to turn this video into a softcore porn, there is a little bit of truth behind the gimmick of blast processing. Let me explain. Now, was blast processing some kind of super overclocking feature or some uber special chip that the Sega Genesis had inside of it? No. What they were referring to is that the Sega Genesis's main CPU, the Motorola 68000, was clocked at 7.6 MHz, while the CPU inside the Super Nintendo, the Ricoh 5A22, was only clocked at 3.6 MHz. Now, although CPU speed is only a small part of the picture when it comes to overall hardware performance, the fact that the Motorola 68000 inside the Sega Genesis is clocked at pretty much double the speed of the CPU inside the Super Nintendo made games run peppier and with somewhat less lag on Sega's 16-bit console.
Rich, why are you being a Sega Genesis fanboy? I want proof that Sega Genesis games can run quicker than games on Super Nintendo.
Okay, you want proof? I have proof that will make you take a seat permanently. Let's take a look. Now, the first game that people talk about when they compare the power of the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis is Sonic the Hedgehog, which, yeah, I get it. The game moves fast, sprites move fast across the screen, but there was never a Sonic the Hedgehog game for the Super Nintendo, so you can't make a direct comparison. But one game you can make a direct comparison with is Street Fighter 2. It was both on the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, and both games had a hyper or turbo mode. Okay, it was hyper on the Sega Genesis and it was turbo on the Super Nintendo. But look, I have both menu screens up here right now. You could see how much faster you could make the Sega Genesis version. Look how many more stars you could add to it. And yeah, I know that doesn't mean too much, but now I have the turbo mode on the SNES set to full tilt, and I have the hyper mode on the Sega Genesis set to full tilt. Look how much faster the Sega Genesis version of Street Fighter 2 is running. It's crazy. And the reason that Capcom was able to make hyper mode on the Sega Genesis version of Street Fighter 2 run much faster is due to the fact that the Sega Genesis had a faster processor. I mean, hell, if you played Street Fighter 2 on the Super Nintendo, even when you ran it at normal speed, the game would still lag. So how much turbo can you get out of the Super Nintendo version of Street Fighter 2 if it lags to begin with? But anyway, that's besides the point. We're off topic here. Let's compare the graphical capabilities of the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. Now, besides for the fact that the Sega Genesis has a peppier processor, the Super Nintendo outperforms it in every other category. We could be here for hours going tit for tat and comparing multiplats on both the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. But the one game that comes to mind that was available for both systems and looked vastly superior on the Super Nintendo was Mortal Kombat 2. The difference is striking. Here, take a look.
Fight!
Now factor in the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 capabilities, its native transparency effects, which the Sega Genesis lacked and can only do through dithering, and that it could output a higher resolution than the Sega Genesis, makes it obvious that the Super Nintendo gave you much better eye candy. But we're not done yet. James also talked about the FX chip, which was a coprocessor put inside certain games such as Star Fox, which allowed the SNES to render 3D graphics. A lot of people got on James's case because in his video he didn't mention virtual racing for the Sega Sega Genesis, which had the SVP chip in it. I totally agree that virtual racing for the Sega Genesis is far superior to Star Fox. It has a better frame rate, more polygons on screen, and all around it's a very impressive port of Sega's arcade racing game. But even with virtual racing for the Sega Genesis, I still agree with James that Super Nintendo had better visuals. You wanna know why? Super Nintendo had Doom! There was two versions of the FX chip. There was one that ran at 10.5 MHz and there was one that ran at 21 MHz. The Doom cartridges received the 21 MHz FX chip, and that allowed them to make Doom happen for the Super Nintendo. Now, is Doom good for the Super Nintendo? No, it sucks. It has a crappy frame rate, it isn't full screen, there's no textures on the floor or ceiling. But the point is that the Sega Genesis, even with the SVP processor, could not do Doom. That is because the Sega Genesis could not output enough colors to run Doom. The Super Nintendo could output 256 colors at once, the Sega Genesis can only do 64 colors at once on screen. So even if Sega had a 3 GHz SVP chip to put in their cartridges, it wouldn't matter. Doom could not be done on the Sega Genesis, and because of that, I have to give this round to the Super Nintendo. When it comes to comparing sound quality between the two consoles, there's really no competition, and here's why. The Sega Genesis uses FM synthesis. Long story short, and to not make this video another 40 minutes, FM synthesis is a dated technology that lets you kind of manipulate sound to sort of sound like instruments. The FM synth chip inside the Sega Genesis was the Yamaha YM2612. That chip was also used in the Japanese FM Towns computer systems and arcade machines. The Super Nintendo uses the Ken Kutaragi designed SPC 700 sound processor. Yes, I'm talking about the father of the PlayStation, Ken Kutaragi. The Super Nintendo uses waveforms stored on a DSP, so the Super Nintendo manipulates actual sound samples, not just noise like the FM synthesis chip on the Sega Genesis. Again, I could go on and on about the SPC 700 sound processor, but the bottom line is that the Super Nintendo had much more advanced sound technology than the Sega Genesis. Okay, I'm gonna shut up now and play some audio samples from both consoles so you could hear the difference. Now don't get me wrong, games can still sound really good on the Sega Genesis. Castlevania Bloodlines and Streets of Rage 1 and 2 come to mind when I think of kick-ass music for Sega's 16-bit console. But just like James said in his video, the Super Nintendo was the first time, at least for me, that video game music didn't sound like video game music. It sounded like real orchestrated soundtracks. And for that reason, I have to give this round to the Super Nintendo, and I think most of you will agree with me. You know what? This is gonna be hard.
Shut your stupid ass up, man.
Yay, you're back.
Let me on that microphone, motherfucker. Yo, peep game, man. The Sega Genesis has the realest librarization of games of all time, man.
Fuck it, just keep going.
Shut up and say stupid, motherfucker. I got a laundry list of realness right here, man. I'm about to kick game to y'all. You know what I'm saying? The Sega Genesis got Streets of Rage. Streets of Rage 2 got that rail music. You know what I'm saying? Sonic the Hedgehog is just rail. Strider, motherfucker. He'll cut your nuts off before you can blink, you know what I'm saying? The Genesis got Castlevania Bloodlines. I know Review Tech Nipples gets hard over that game, you know what I'm saying? And you got the realness, man. You got Splatterhouse 2 and Splatterhouse 3, you know what I'm saying? Those games are just real, cause I'm real, you know what I'm saying?
No, I don't know what you're saying. Why don't you say you know what I'm saying a couple more times and maybe I will know what you're saying? You know what I'm saying?
Shut the fuck up, man.
Alright, I'll give it to you. That was a really good list. I played every game on that list as a kid and they're all amazing. I played the shit out of them. But the Super Nintendo had amazing games as well. And I'll tell you my favorite games right now. Peep game, yo.
Shut the fuck up, man. You sound like an asshole.
Thank you. Anyway, God, where do I even begin? And I know I forgot about other games that I love too, but Super Mario World, amazing. Super Castlevania 4. How many times have I talked about how much I love Super Castlevania 4? Super Metroid, awesome game. Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, a classic, arguably the best Legend of Zelda game ever made. Mega Man X, phenomenal game. I never beat it because it's hard as hell, but I love Mega Man X. SimCity, once I learned I needed to connect power plants to buildings to make them grow, was an addicting game. I played it for months on end. And I'm not a big RPG guy, but I did really enjoy Final Fantasy III, aka Final Fantasy VI. Awesome game with incredible music. So I don't know. I'm calling a tie with this one.
Cause you's a punk ass bitch.
Yep, that's the reason. Or it could be that both systems have amazing libraries of games. This round, it's a tie. Way too many good titles on both systems to say one is on top. So at this point, I'm sure you're expecting me to say which console I feel is the better of the two. Well, I can't. Calm down, it's video games, it's not that big a deal. I had both the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo as a kid, and I loved both systems and played them both equally. You could talk all day about technical specs and graphics and sound, but what it comes down to is the games, and both systems had amazing games like I just mentioned. Sure, Sega came out with some dumb peripherals, and both Nintendo and Sega had these nasty ad campaigns that threw mud at each other, but we the consumers benefited from the fierce competition going on between Nintendo and Sega. We got great games for both consoles and fantastic childhood memories that I will always cherish. So in the end, to me, both the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo are both fantastic systems, and I enjoy playing them both equally. Coco, you got anything else you want to say?
Yeah, man, you got some big ass hairy titties, motherfucker.
Thank you, man, that was poetry. This is Rich of Review Tech USA, signing out.
I often make my wife wear purple panties and smack her ass until it turns blue like a baboon's, which also arouses me.